The towering glass facade of the Midwest Policy Forum gleamed like a blade against the gunmetal sky of Columbus, Ohio. Inside the building's grand atrium, journalists and political staffers mingled in an atmosphere thick with ambition and the lingering scent of expensive cologne. The annual Heartland Summit was underway, a gathering where policy met politics and where careers could be made or broken with a single soundbite. Megan Carter adjusted her press badge, its laminated surface catching the light as she rehearsed the questions in her mind for the 20th time that morning. At 32, Megan had spent the last decade climbing the ranks at Capitol Beat, a digital news platform known for its aggressive political coverage and left-leaning perspective. With her sleek auburn bob and perpetually furrowed brow, she had cultivated an on-camera persona that projected confidence and relentless determination. "You're sure this is going to work?" asked Raj, her cameraman, as he checked his equipment. His fingers moved over the camera with practiced precision, his expression betraying his apprehension. "Trust me," Megan replied, her voice low but vibrating with intensity. "When I corner Vice President Vance with these questions, his whole man of the People's Act will fall apart. Once he stumbles, and he will stumble, we'll have the viral moment Capitol Beat needs." She tapped her tablet where she had meticulously assembled what she believed were devastating contradictions in the vice president's policy positions. "I don't know, Megan. Security is tight, and his team screens questions," Raj cautioned, glancing nervously at the Secret Service agents positioned throughout the room. "That's why we're not going through the official channels," Megan whispered, her eyes scanning the room. "We'll catch him during the transition between the main hall and the breakout sessions. No handlers, no prepared statements, just raw reaction. If you're enjoying this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel now. Just hit that subscribe button and notification bell to stay updated with all our latest videos." In the adjoining ballroom, Vice President JD Vance was concluding his keynote address. At 43, Vance had maintained the straightforward demeanor that had characterized his rise from Yale law graduate to best-selling author to the second highest office in the land. His speech, focused on economic revitalization in post-industrial communities, had been delivered without the soaring rhetoric typical of Washington politicians, but with the measured cadence of someone who had actually lived the struggles he described. And that's why investment in vocational training isn't just good policy, it's recognizing the dignity of work that has built this country. Vance's voice carried through the speakers as Megan positioned herself near the exit door. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, adrenaline flooding her system. "Ready?" she mouthed to Raj, who nodded reluctantly. The audience applauded as Vance stepped away from the podium. Secret Service agents moved forward, creating a pathway through the crowd as the vice president made his way toward the door where Megan waited. Unlike many politicians who lost themselves in the adoration of a crowd, Vance moved with purpose, occasionally pausing to shake a hand or exchange brief words with an attendee. This was the moment Megan had strategized for. As Vance approached the doorway, she stepped forward, microphone extended, Raj's camera light suddenly illuminating the space between them. "Vice President Vance!" Megan called out, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Megan Carter from Capitol Beat. I'd like to ask you about your apparent policy flip-flops since taking office." The Secret Service agents tensed, but Vance raised a hand slightly, signaling them to hold their position. He turned toward Megan, his expression neutral but attentive. "In your book, you criticize government assistance programs, but now your office is championing expanded benefits for working families," Megan continued, words tumbling out rapidly. "How do you explain this contradiction to voters who believed in your original position?" Around them, other journalists had noticed the impromptu exchange, a ripple of anticipation traveling through the crowd. Phones were raised, additional cameras pointed their way. The hallway had become a stage neither had planned for. Vance studied Megan for a beat longer than was comfortable, his gaze direct. When he spoke, his voice was measured, lacking the defensive edge Megan had anticipated. "That's an interesting framing, Ms. Carter," he replied, "but I think you're conflating criticism of program implementation with opposition to the goals those programs serve." Megan pressed on, determined not to lose control of the narrative. But in Chapter 8 of Hillbilly Elegy, you specifically stated that government handouts created dependency cycles. Now you're expanding those same programs. Something changed in Vance's eyes. Not anger, but a sharpening of focus. The subtle shift made Megan falter momentarily. I appreciate you've read my book, Vance said, though perhaps selectively. If you look at page 238, I wrote that the question isn't whether we need assistance programs, but how we structure them to provide both support and pathways to self-sufficiency. He paused, letting the correction land. What my office is proposing now follows that exact philosophy. Support that reinforces work and family stability, not replaces it. Megan felt the first flutter of unease. This wasn't going as planned. Vance wasn't becoming defensive or flustered. Instead, he seemed almost prepared for this line of questioning. But your voting record in the Senate, she began, shows consistent support for policies that invest in working families while requiring program accountability. Vance completed her thought. I've never changed my position that government should help create conditions for success, not dependency. The small crowd that had gathered was watching intently now. Megan could feel the exchange slipping away from her. This ambush was meant to expose contradiction, not invite reasoned explanation. What about your criticism of coastal elites when you yourself are Yale-educated? She pivoted sharply, her voice rising slightly. Isn't there hypocrisy in claiming to represent working-class values with your Ivy League credentials? The hallway had grown silent. Even the ambient sounds of the conference seemed to have faded. For a moment, Megan thought she'd found her opening, the question that would unsettle him. Vance nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of the question rather than its accusation. When he responded, his voice had softened, carrying a hint of something that might have been reflection. You know, that's actually a fair question, he began, surprising Megan. I've been fortunate to experience both worlds. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio, where most people I knew worked with their hands when they could find work at all. Later, I walked the halls of Yale Law School. Having a foot in both worlds doesn't make me a hypocrite. It gives me perspective. He gestured to the conference around them. We're in a room full of policy experts today, many with advanced degrees. That education is valuable, but policies fail when they're designed without understanding the lived experiences of the people they're meant to help. Megan felt the ground shifting beneath her. This wasn't the combative exchange she'd envisioned. The vice president wasn't evading or attacking. He was engaging thoughtfully. Worse, from her perspective, he was coming across as reasonable and authentic. Your administration has proposed cuts to, she tried again. Reallocation, not cuts, Vance corrected firmly. If you look at the actual budget proposal, page 142, section 3, you'll see that funding for community support programs increases by 12%. What we've proposed is moving money from administrative overhead to direct services. Megan blinked, thrown by the specific citation. Had he memorized the entire budget? But rural voters were promised policies that would recognize their communities as vital to American prosperity, not just cultural curiosities, Vance interjected, a new intensity entering his voice. The problem with Washington for too long has been treating rural and working-class America as either a problem to be solved or a resource to be extracted. The crowd around them had grown. Megan could sense Raj shifting uncomfortably behind the camera. This was not the gotcha moment they had come for. Instead, the vice president was using her ambush as a platform to articulate his positions, with a clarity that was rarely afforded in standard media appearances. Let me ask you something, Ms. Carter, Vance continued, unexpectedly turning the exchange around. Have you spent much time in the communities we're discussing? Places like Middletown, or Jackson, Kentucky, or Uniontown, Pennsylvania? The question caught Megan off guard. Her background was in political reporting. She'd covered campaigns in Capitol Hill, not spent time embedding in rural communities. I've reported on economic issues across. That's not what I asked, Vance said gently but firmly. I'm not questioning your professional capabilities. I'm suggesting that understanding comes from experience, not just analysis. Megan felt her professional facade crack slightly. The exchange had veered into territory she hadn't prepared for. Not policy contradictions, but questions about the lens through which she viewed the very issues she was challenging him on. Look, politicians flip-flop all the time, she said, attempting to regain momentum. Voters have a right to know when their representatives change positions. Absolutely, Vance agreed readily, and they also deserve more than gotcha journalism that reduces complex issues to assumed contradictions. The headline you came here to create was, Vance contradicts previous positions. What we're actually discussing is how consistent principles apply to changing circumstances. The crowd had grown silent, watching the exchange with the rapt attention of spectators at an intellectual tennis match. Megan could feel sweat forming at her temples. What had begun as her ambush of the vice president had somehow transformed into something else entirely. The facts matter, Ms. Carter, Vance continued. When you claim I've reversed positions, you're not just questioning my consistency, but suggesting dishonesty. If we're going to have this conversation, let's at least base it on what I've actually said and done, not on oversimplified characterizations. Megan felt a flush of embarrassment rising from her neck to her cheeks. The carefully constructed narrative she'd planned was unraveling, not because Vance was avoiding her questions, but because he was addressing them with unexpected nuance and specific rebuttals. My point is, she tried again. Your point, Vance said, his voice still measured but carrying a new weight, seems to be that political consistency means never evolving one's approach, even as circumstances change. That's not governance. That's ideology. He gestured to a young staffer who had appeared at his side with a tablet. Taking it, he quickly scrolled to something before turning the screen toward Megan and the camera. Here's my Senate floor speech from 3 years ago, where I specifically outlined the principles that guide my positions on economic support programs. You'll notice that what we're implementing now aligns perfectly with what I advocated then. Megan glanced at the screen, seeing the timestamp and the text of a speech she hadn't included in her research. The realization that she had missed, or perhaps her research team had deliberately excluded, relevant context left her momentarily speechless. I believe in intellectual honesty, Ms. Carter, Vance continued. When I'm wrong, I'll say so. When circumstances require adaptation, I'll explain why. But what I won't do is pretend that sound bites and selective quotations represent the complexity of governance. The gathered crowd had begun to murmur, some nodding in agreement with the vice president. Megan could feel the moment slipping further away from her. What had been designed as an ambush had transformed into an impromptu masterclass in political communication. We're out of time, a Secret Service agent interjected, moving closer to Vance. Vance nodded in acknowledgement but turned back to Megan. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify these points, Ms. Carter. My office is always available if you want to schedule a formal interview where we can dive deeper into policy specifics. He extended his hand. The gesture, professional, courteous, with no hint of the confrontation that had just occurred, left Megan momentarily frozen. Then, almost automatically, she took his hand in a brief shake. Thank you for your questions, Vance added, before the Secret Service detail guided him away toward the next scheduled event. As the vice president disappeared down the hallway, Megan stood motionless, still processing what had just occurred. Raj lowered his camera, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been reluctant admiration. That did not go as planned, he said quietly. Megan simply nodded, her mind racing. The story she had come for had transformed into something entirely different. Instead of exposing contradiction, she had encountered preparation and depth that her simplified narrative hadn't accounted for. Did you get it all? She finally asked Raj. Every second, he confirmed. But Megan, this isn't the hit piece you pitched to the editor. She knew he was right. What had been captured wasn't political fumbling or hypocrisy exposed, but something rarely seen in modern political coverage. A genuine exchange where assumptions were challenged and depth prevailed over simplicity. As they packed up their equipment, Megan noticed several attendees watching her, some with expressions that suggested her reputation had been affected by the exchange. An older journalist she recognized from a competing network approached. Tough day at the office, he commented, not unkindly. Megan straightened her shoulders. He was prepared. I'll give him that. The older journalist studied her for a moment. You know what the real story is here, don't you? Not that you tried to ambush him, but that he turned it into a lesson on political substance over theater. His words stung because they contained truth. As a political journalist, Meghan had built her career on moments of contradiction and conflict, on the drama of politics rather than its substance. For the first time, she wondered if she had been missing something essential. Back in her hotel room that evening, Meghan reviewed the footage, watched it once, twice, a third time. With each viewing, her perspective shifted slightly. What had felt like professional humiliation in the moment now revealed itself as something more complex. Vance hadn't demolished her with partisan talking points or defensive aggression. He had simply been better prepared, more thoughtful, and unwilling to accept the frame she had tried to impose on the conversation. Her phone buzzed with a text from her editor. "Where's the clip you promised? The Vance meltdown?" Meghan stared at the message, then back at the footage playing on her laptop. What she had was the opposite of a meltdown. It was a masterclass in political communication, in responding to ambush journalism with facts and context, rather than anger or evasion. Her finger hovered over the keyboard. The easy path would be to cut the footage to emphasize her strongest moments and downplay Vance's responses. She could still create something that fit the narrative her audience expected, the narrative she had promised her editor. Instead, she began typing, "I don't have a meltdown to show you. I have something better, something real." 3 days later, Capital Beat published Meghan's piece, titled "Beyond the Ambush, A Lesson in Political Substance." The full unedited footage of her exchange with Vice President Vance accompanied an article in which Meghan did something few political journalists ever do. She acknowledged the limitations of her approach and reflected on the value of depth over drama in political coverage. The piece went viral, though not for the reasons she had originally intended. Viewers across the political spectrum shared and commented on the rare sight of a politician responding to ambush with substance, and a journalist willing to acknowledge when an exchange had not gone as planned. 6 weeks later, Meghan sat in a different hotel room in a different city, preparing for another interview. But this time, her tablet contained not gotcha questions designed to provoke a reaction, but thoughtful inquiries aimed at understanding complexity. Her phone buzzed with a text from Raj. "You ready for this? Different approach this time?" Meghan smiled slightly as she replied, "Different approach." Better journalism. The lesson she had learned in that hallway hadn't just changed one story, it had transformed her understanding of her profession. In an age of soundbites and Twitter wars, she had been reminded that beneath the theater of politics lay the substance of governance, complicated and nuanced in ways that deserved more than ambush journalism could reveal. And somewhere in Washington, Vice President Vance added Meghan's article to a growing file, not of media victories or defeats, but of moments when the national conversation had briefly transcended the simplified narratives that too often defined it, offering instead a glimpse of what political discourse could be when facts were allowed to speak for themselves.